In the 1,930 seconds, every gangster in New York lived by the bullet. But Bumpy Johnson? He bet his life on 7 inches of Sheffield steel. Why carry a barber's tool when your enemies have firepower? Bumpy's answer was simple. Guns are loud and impersonal. A razor? That's an intimate conversation. On March 15th, 1935, at the Savoy Ballroom, a mobster named Vic Romano decided to test that theory. He doused the legendary Duke Ellington in champagne, thinking he owned the room. But as the music died, he realized he wasn't in the Bronx anymore. He was in Bumpy's house. In 1935, America was a map of lines you weren't supposed to cross. But the Savoy Ballroom? It was the exception. They called it the home of happy feet. A massive sanctuary on Lenox Avenue where the air didn't care about the color of your skin. On that polished maple floor, 4,000 people could forget the world outside. It was a rare bubble of equality, a place where dignity was the only currency that mattered. Until exactly 11:47 p.m. on March 15th. The music was soaring when the champagne exploded. Vic Romano, a man with a sneer as sharp as a blade, popped a bottle of $200 Dom Perignon not to celebrate, but to humiliate. He sprayed it across Duke Ellington and his piano like he was watering a lawn. In an instant, the jazz died. 200 people froze. Now, history often paints this as a simple mafia dispute, but the truth is far more dangerous. Vic Romano wasn't just a mobster. He was a top-tier capo for Dutch Schultz. And Schultz? He wasn't part of the Italian Five Families. He was a German-Jewish kingpin who ran a mixed crew of the most ruthless mercenaries in New York. They were unpredictable, brutal, and they were hungry for Harlem's rackets. Romano's presence wasn't just a drunken mistake. It was a calculated invasion. He wasn't just disrespecting a musician. He was testing the borders of a kingdom. If Schultz's men could humiliate Duke Ellington in the Savoy, the very heart of Harlem's culture, then they could take the streets. This was a test of sovereignty. They thought the firepower of a mixed crew and the name of Dutch Schultz would make everyone bow. They thought a man with a gun could break the spirit of a sanctuary. They were wrong, because while Romano brought the noise, Bumpy Johnson was about to bring the silence. The music died, and for a heartbeat, the only sound in the Savoy was the drip of champagne hitting the floor. Duke Ellington stood frozen, a genius humiliated. Vic Romano was still laughing, his voice a jagged tear in the silence. But at the back of the ballroom, Bumpy Johnson pushed off the wall. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He moved with the calculated grace of a predator who had already won. He was draped in a charcoal 3-piece suit, tailored to a needlepoint. His patent leather shoes caught the light, clicking against the polished maple times, click, 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 times a steady, rhythmic countdown. Beside him stood Stephanie Street Claire, the queen of numbers, elegant and lethal in crimson. They weren't just gangsters. They were the law. To understand Bumpy, you have to understand the brain behind the blade. They called him the scholar of the Underworld. While other men spent their afternoons at the track, Bumpy was in the library or hunched over a chessboard in the park. He didn't just play the game. He calculated it 10 moves ahead. He read Machiavelli, not to learn how to be a tyrant, but to master the cold mechanics of power. To Bumpy, this wasn't a ballroom brawl. It was a finished equation. This is what experts call high-resolution power. Most men rely on the noise of a gun because they are afraid of the distance. A gun is impersonal. It's a loud, messy explosion that ends a life from across the room. It's a coward's shortcut. But a razor? A razor is an intimate conversation. To use it, you have to step into a man's breathing space. You have to commit. You have to look into his eyes and watch the moment he realizes his life is no longer his own. As Bumpy walked, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. He wasn't just carrying a tool, he was carrying a philosophy. Vic Romano had the firepower, the loud mouth, and 6 armed men, but Bumpy had the silence. And in Harlem, silence is the deadliest weapon in the room. Romano's laughter began to wither as he looked at Bumpy's face. There was no rage there, just a cold, empty calculation. Bumpy wasn't walking toward a fight. He was walking toward a conclusion he had already reached 10 minutes ago. Vic Romano had a gun, but he was about to learn that in a house of kings, a gun is just a toy. A razor is a promise. Bumpy didn't reach for a gun. He didn't have to. He just stopped at the edge of the table, his presence turning the air into lead. See, the Savoy was more than just a dance hall. In 1935, America was bleeding under the weight of Jim Crow. But inside these walls, that poison didn't exist. The Savoy was an integrated sanctuary, a rare laboratory of equality, where black and white shared the same floor, the same music, and the same dignity. It was Harlem's crown jewel. When Vic Romano sprayed that champagne, he wasn't just a drunk mobster being a nuisance. He was an invader. He was attempting to re-establish the hierarchy of hate in the one place that had evolved past it. Bumpy knew that if he let this slide, the sanctuary would crumble. If Romano could humiliate Duke Ellington here, then Harlem was already lost. "Stand up, Vic." Bumpy's voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the ballroom like the Sheffield steel he carried. Romano tried to grin, tried to play the tough guy. "What's your problem, boy?" The word times, boy times, hit the room like a gunshot. The silence became absolute. 200 people held their breath, watching Bumpy's right hand. He pulled the razor from his waistband, still in its leather sheath, holding it casually in his palm. "I'm going to give you 2 choices, Vic," Bumpy said, his eyes cold and empty, the eyes of a man who had already decided the ending. Choice 1. You apologize to Mr. Ellington. Loud, clear, in front of everyone. Then you walk out of the Savoy. You leave Harlem, and you tell Dutch Schultz that this neighborhood is permanently closed to his business. Vic's voice cracked. "And choice 2? Bumpy smiled, the kind of smile that makes a man's blood turn to ice. "Choice 2 is I open this razor and show you why they call me the King of Harlem." And Vic, I'm really hoping you pick choice 2, because guns are impersonal. You pull a trigger from across the room. It's clean, it's easy. But a razor? A razor requires commitment. I want to get close. I want to look you in the eyes while I open you up. I want to hear you beg. I want to smell your fear. Romano looked at his 6 gunmen. They were armed, they were heavy, but they were frozen. They had seen the bodies Bumpy left behind. The enforcers found in alleys with their throats opened. The traitors with their tongues cut out. They knew Bumpy Johnson didn't make threats. He made promises. Vic met Duke's eyes and croaked out an apology that stained the air. But Bumpy wasn't done. He leaned in, inches from Romano's face. "If I ever hear your name north of 110th Street again, I won't give you choices. I'll just open this razor and paint the streets with you. And when Dutch Schultz asks what happened, I'll send him your tongue in a box with a note that says, 'Harlem ain't for sale.'" With a soft times-click asterisk, Bumpy closed the razor. The sound echoed like a closing casket. Romano and his crew didn't just leave, they vanished. They walked out of the Savoy like men attending their own funeral, leaving the crown jewel of Harlem exactly as Bumpy intended it to be. Untouched, unbowed, and undisputed. As the doors of the Savoy swung shut behind Romano, the suffocating silence didn't vanish, it transformed. It became a space for something else. Duke Ellington, the most dignified man in Harlem, sat back down at his piano. His hands, the hands of a genius, were shaking. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at Bumpy. Tears filled his eyes. It wasn't fear. It was the weight of being seen. For the first time in a world that demanded he wear a mask of careful neutrality, Duke felt protected. He didn't have to smile through the spit. He didn't have to navigate the disrespect with grace. Bumpy had drawn a line in the sand with 7 inches of Sheffield steel, and Duke finally felt his own dignity as a solid, unbreakable thing. He hit the keys. Asterisk. It don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. Asterisk. But the music was different now. It was louder, more defiant. It was the sound of a man who no longer had to apologize for his excellence, because there is a price to excellence. Men like Romano don't just hate talent, they are terrified by it. They see a black man with a tuxedo and a mind that can weave masterpieces, and it shatters their sense of superiority. They want the jazz, but they hate the artist. They want the rhythm, but they want to crush the soul that created it. They want the culture, but only if they can own it. Bumpy Johnson understood the game. He wasn't just defending a musician. He was defending the very idea of black excellence that refused to bow. Dutch Schultz didn't take the lesson to heart at first. He sent more enforcers. 2 weeks later, they were fished out of the Harlem River with razors embedded in their chests. A note was pinned to one of them. Asterisk postage paid. Return to sender. Asterisk. Within 3 months, the Italian mob withdrew from Harlem entirely. They realized that in this kingdom, the price of admission was their very lives. Harlem wasn't a business opportunity anymore. It was a fortress. Years later, Duke Ellington visited Bumpy Johnson in the cold silence of Alcatraz. A lifetime of different choices separated them by a glass partition. Duke asked the one question that had lingered for decades. Why? You could have let it go. You could have avoided all of this. Bumpy smiled. He looked at the bars of his cell, then back at the man who gave Harlem its heartbeat. Duke, he said, his voice a low rumble. Do you know the difference between a gangster and a king? A gangster takes. A king protects. That night at the Savoy wasn't about a spilled bottle of wine or a drunken mobster. It was about a boundary. Bumpy wasn't just defending a piano player. He was defending the soul of a people. He was protecting black excellence, the kind that doesn't apologize, doesn't bow, and refuses to accept disrespect just because a powerful man expects it. The lesson was clear. Dignity is not a bargaining chip. It is not something you negotiate or trade for a quiet life. Dignity is the hill you die on. It is a promise you make to your community that says, asterisk, we belong here, and we are not for sale. Asterisk. When Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, they found that same straight razor in his pocket. It was still sharp, still ready. It carried the same silent message he sent that March night in 1935. Harlem protects its own. You can own the city, and you can own the law, but you will never own a man who is willing to look you in the eye and risk everything for his respect. If this story of courage and street justice moved you, hit that subscribe button and smash the like. Share this with someone who needs to understand what real leadership looks like, the kind forged in the streets, not the boardroom. Drop a comment below. What does protecting your community mean to you? Let's keep Bumpy's legacy alive. The King of Harlem stood up when everyone else stayed silent. Will you?